greatest story.
Ava Sinclair, female lead, 19 years old, a smart, modest black girl, the daughter of a successful businessman but grew up in simplicity. She has just been accepted to Stanford University. Eleanor Monroe, villain, 25 years old, a flight attendant, white, middle class, but with hidden racist thoughts. She does not like inappropriate people appearing in the upper class. David Sinclair, Ava's father, a successful businessman but always lives a simple life. He is the founder and owner of a major airline. Captain William Carter, the person who holds the biggest twist in the story, has power in his hands. The group of passengers, initially prejudiced, but then has a change in thinking. Dreams come true. It's a morning in New York. The early sunlight shines through the glass windows of a modest but neat house. Ava Sinclair sat on her bed, holding her first-class plane ticket. She couldn't believe it. First class. "You booked this for me," David Sinclair beamed. "I worked so hard and I deserve it." "First class, Dad? I don't need it." Ava shook her head but couldn't hide her joy. "I deserve the best, and this is just the beginning." Ava hugged her father tightly. She had never flown first class before, but she didn't know that this flight would change everything. Airports and scrutinizing eyes. The next morning, Ava arrived at JFK. She was wearing a loose hoodie, jeans, sneakers, and a small suitcase. She looked like a regular college student. As she stood in line at the first-class gate, a few eyes immediately swept over her. Some looked her up and down, frowning, as if she didn't belong. A middle-aged woman whispered to her husband, "Can everyone fly first class now?" Ava ignored it, trying to keep her spirits up. Entering the first-class cabin, Ava stepped onto the plane, looking around. The high-quality leather seats, the spacious space, the attentive service staff. This was truly a different world. She found her seat 3A. But as Ava put her bag down, a voice rang out from behind her. "Excuse me? Are you sure this is your seat?" Ava turned around, a young woman, about 25 years old, wearing a flight attendant uniform, her hair tied up, red lipstick. It was Eleanor Monroe. Eleanor looked Ava up and down, her eyes filled with suspicion. Ava nodded, holding out her ticket. "Yes, this is my seat." Eleanor glanced at the ticket, then frowned. "This is first class." Her voice was a little contemptuous. Ava could clearly feel it. "I know," Ava replied calmly. "My ticket was first class." Eleanor curled her lips, disbelieving. "There must have been a mistake," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. A few passengers began to take notice. A middle-aged man shook his head slightly. A woman sneered. "First class isn't what it used to be anymore," someone whispered. Ava clenched her fists. "My ticket was scanned at the gate. I didn't make a mistake." Ava could feel it. Things were getting worse. A few minutes later, Eleanor returned, her voice much sharper this time, no longer polite. "I'm saying this for the last time. If you can't prove that this ticket is yours, I'll have to ask you to leave first class immediately." The silence was deafening. Ava raised her head, her hard eyes meeting Eleanor's. "I gave you the ticket." "What else is there to prove?" Ava said, her voice no longer as gentle as before. But Eleanor only smirked contemptuously. "You know," Eleanor drawled, clearly not a suggestion, but a veiled threat. "First class is not for everyone." Her words were full of innuendo. Ava clenched her hands on the arms of her chair, feeling anger flare up in her chest. But before she could react, Eleanor suddenly reached out, snatching the ticket from Ava's hand. The entire first-class cabin froze. "Hey, what are you doing?" Ava jumped up, startled as Eleanor casually turned the ticket in her hands, as if she had the power to decide its fate. Eleanor glanced at the ticket, then back at Ava, her eyes filled with suspicion, even contempt. "Let's do this," she said slowly, waving another flight attendant over. "We'll check your ticket through the airline system. If your name isn't on the list, then you should prepare to leave immediately." Ava choked, her whole body burning with anger and humiliation. She couldn't believe it. She had scanned her ticket at the gate. She had been accepted onto the plane. But now, just because of the color of her skin, she had to prove herself again. The passengers around her began to whisper, some nodding in agreement, some glancing at Ava with displeasure, as if she were really a fraud. A middle-aged man in seat 2B shook his head slightly, lowering his voice to his wife. "First class isn't like it used to be anymore. Anyone can get in here." Ava heard every word clearly. Her heart ached. Eleanor didn't stop there. She looked at Ava, then suddenly grabbed Ava's arm, pulling her up from her seat. "You stand up! Go!" Eleanor's voice was cold, emotionless. At that moment, Ava felt like she was being humiliated in front of everyone. A shock ran down her spine. "What are you doing?" Ava shook Eleanor's hand away, her eyes blazing with anger. But Eleanor did not flinch. She just smiled faintly, then said in an authoritative voice, "If you can't prove that you belong here, then I have no obligation to respect you." Another flight attendant, now looking confused, handed Ava's ticket back to Eleanor after checking the system. "Her name is indeed on the list," the flight attendant whispered, looking embarrassed. But instead of stopping, Eleanor tried to push the matter further. She smiled faintly, waving for 2 airline security officers to come over. The first-class cabin gasped. "Please check for me," Eleanor said, her voice deliberately louder than usual, enough for all the passengers to hear. "This girl doesn't look like someone who could afford a first-class ticket. I'm afraid it might be a fake ticket or there's some kind of fraud." What a shock. The surrounding passengers began to gossip even louder. Ava stood there, stunned. She had never felt so insulted before. She had been forced into a position where she couldn't defend herself, couldn't protest without making things worse. The whispers, the suspicious looks, the mocking looks. And Eleanor standing there, smug. In that moment, Ava felt like she was being judged just because of the color of her skin. This wasn't just about the seat. This was about how the world saw her, a black girl in the upper class, and they didn't accept it. The last straw. Ava clenched her fists, trying to stay calm. Before Ava could react, a deep but authoritative voice rang out from behind her. "What's going on here?" The first-class cabin fell into absolute silence. All eyes turned to the voice. From the front of the cabin, a tall, imposing man, his captain's uniform immaculately pressed, strode in. Captain William Carter, the most powerful person on this flight, was standing right in the middle of the first-class cabin. Eleanor Monroe froze. The previous arrogant confidence had completely evaporated from her face. She straightened, swallowed, trying to keep her composure, but her eyes were filled with panic. "Captain!" Eleanor cleared her throat, regaining her professional demeanor, her tone trying to sound calm. "I was just checking this girl's seat. I think there's been some confusion about her class." Ava clenched her fists. Eleanor still wouldn't give up. She was still trying to push her out of first class at all costs. But this time, she had chosen the wrong opponent. Captain Carter looked at Eleanor with icy eyes, then cut her off immediately. There was no mistake. His voice was so cold that it sent shivers through the cabin. He ignored Eleanor, walked straight to Ava, and suddenly smiled warmly. "Ava Sinclair, nice to meet you." Ava was stunned. She had not expected this at all. You know me?" Captain Carter laughed, his voice deep but resounding like a thunderclap in the air. "Of course, your father is the owner of this airline." The first-class cabinet was completely silent. Only the sound of the plane's engine whirred through the air. Eleanor stood there, her eyes absolutely wide, her face pale. The passengers began to whisper in panic. A woman's eyes widened, her voice trembling as she asked, "She is the president's daughter?" Another man gasped, "Oh my God! I thought she was just some lucky student." The surrounding passengers were stunned. A feeling of shame filled the faces of those who had just expressed doubt about Ava. They had made a huge mistake. The price of prejudice. Captain Carter turned slowly, his eyes freezing as he looked at Eleanor. "What did you do to a VIP of this airline?" His voice was not loud, but it was enough to make the air heavy. Eleanor's mouth fell open, but she couldn't form a single excuse. She was pale, her forehead beaded with sweat, but she tried to force herself to keep her composure. "Captain, You insulted her," Captain Carter interrupted. "You disrespected a VIP just because you misjudged her." Eleanor trembled. This was no small matter anymore. This was her career. Captain Carter crossed his arms and continued, his voice more serious than ever. "Not only did you insult our customers, you abused your power, discriminated against them, and deliberately humiliated a passenger in front of dozens of people. That is unforgivable." Eleanor was stunned. She bit her lip, her eyes filled with panic. Captain Carter glanced at the other 2 flight attendants who had witnessed the entire incident. Get Eleanor out of first class immediately. The two flight attendants immediately moved forward, standing on either side of Eleanor. Wait! Wait! Eleanor shrieked, stepping back, but there was no escape. You can't do this to me! Procedure! I'm just defending my class! Captain Carter looked at her with disgust. You're not defending your class. You're defending your prejudices. Eleanor stood there dumbfounded. She was dragged out of first class, under the mocking gazes of several passengers. But that was not the end of the punishment. The end could not be saved. Just a few minutes after Eleanor was dragged away, the plane's loudspeakers blared. Internal announcement. Chief Flight Attendant Eleanor Monroe has committed a serious breach of code of conduct. She is fired immediately and banned from working for any airline in the International Airline Alliance. The whole cabin shook. Eleanor, now held at the back of the plane, paled, stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. No way. She didn't just lose her job. She lost her entire career. No airline in the world would dare to hire a flight attendant with such a stain. Captain Carter turned off the microphone, looked at Ava, and gave a small smile. I hope you still want to continue your journey. Ava took a deep breath, turned to Eleanor, her eyes still calm but sharp. It's not the seat. Ava's voice was sharp, echoing in the cabin. It's the way you think I don't belong here. Eleanor collapsed. She was completely devastated. Ava looked out the window, not happy, because she knew it wasn't just her. She knew there were many people like Eleanor out there, but at least today, justice had prevailed. After the plane landed, the story of the girl suspected of skin color in first class spread quickly. News agencies reported it loudly. Eleanor Monroe became a terrible example of racism. Ava Sinclair, on the other hand, became an icon, not because she was the daughter of the airline owner, but because she stood up for herself, because she showed the world that no one has the right to judge a person just because of their appearance. After listening to the above story, what does it say? Don't judge a person just by their appearance. Respect must be the default. Justice will always speak up. Have you ever been judged wrongly? Comment your thoughts.